We're really determined to demonstrate that you can farm without chemicals and a lot of the industrial inputs that we've become reliant on in conventional agriculture. But to do that in this climate, it has been quite a challenge, but we're really happy with the progress that we've made. Farmers are actually taking on the role that they really deserve to play, which is so critical in our society. I guess people saw it as moving into almost a hobby farm on 650 acres when we'd started out on 18,000 acres. So in holistic management, we've looked at breeds specifically that suit this climate so that we don't have to support them with anything to deal with parasites and any unnatural, I guess, inputs into the system.
The intensive grazing with the animals is the key. The more animals we can put in a smaller area for a short period of time and then give that soil rest. And that's where we achieve that with the chooks, because we could put the numbers of chooks here in a little area. The pigs, not until we got sort of 80 to 100 pigs in a mob that we actually started making a difference. And now with 200 cattle, we can make a difference on little paddocks. So most of our paddocks are around that 2 to 3 hectare mark. And we put them in there overnight or for 24 hours and keep rotating them around. And the constant moving, mowing and resting of the ground, plus all the other things that come along with the animals being a small area with all that manure.
When we selected the enterprises, each of them had a role to play. And the pigs are amazing at regenerating soil. The country that they were on had a really bad infestation of burr. It was higher than the bonnet of the tractor when we started out there. Over time, just through that management using the pigs, we did graze the cattle through there as well, but predominantly it was the pig impact that reduced the burr so that without any chemical spray, it's not an issue, put it that way. There's still some burr in the paddock, but nothing like what was there before. So that's just come about because of the improvement in the soil health and the nutrients within the soil, supporting more palatable plant species and pastures.
Back in 2008, I walked Dakota and got really sick, and then we graduated from RCS, Resource Consulting Services, and a man was giving a talk about biodynamics, Shane Joyce, and there was another man there,
Gary McDougall.
He also gave a talk about the Dawson program, and because I was on the verge of chronic fatigue and very sick after walking Dakota, it sort of triggered us into something different, and that's all come about from RCS and being introduced to out there thinking people, basically.
It wasn't until we started to delve into biodynamics that we realised that everything is already there. Nature provides, it's a bit like a compost extract, so you apply the preparations in water, you mix them using a flow form to energise the water, and that can then be applied to any paddock as many times as you like. The rate is almost irrelevant. It stimulates what's already happening in that environment. And the next stage for us, which we've just started to delve into, is the multi-species crops. Because as we build the biology in the soil, they provide a food source and an environment that supports the rapid growth of that biology. We can certainly grow crops during winter that are a great feed, so you get that as the byproduct. Socially, they're just craving connection with real things, particularly food and farms, and we've seen that as people have got into gardening for the very first time. I guess it's really recognising the important role that farmers play, but it's just so important. You can watch things on TV, you can see stuff on social media, but until you actually immerse yourself listen to the farmer, and our farmers are our best advocates, and that happens at the farmers markets as well.
They get to know that guaranteed a chemical-free grass pasture-raised product, whether it be the eggs or the beef. We sell nearly 1,000 dozen eggs a week into town, and we've been doing that for years.
6 years, yeah.
And the quality is the same due to irrigation, pasture, what's happening in those paddocks, and the same with the beef. Every time we sell a beef to a customer, we guarantee it's going to be an eating experience.
It'll eat well, but not only that, it's the flavour. And that is what has won us our awards, is a combination of the rare and heritage breeds, but also the nutritious pasture that they graze. In my research, in my marketing research, had been looking for a group that we could latch onto, and there wasn't really anything happening locally until the project started back in 2013. I was on the steering committee for the original project, which then became the network. So it's just totally in alignment with our values and what we think is really important, which is building this local food system and a community around our food.
Okay, so yeah, that's 11 years in the making. We've been up here for 11 years now. It's coming into our 12th year. So we started with a cane farm, a straight out cane farm, and converted into what you've just seen there. Some of the enterprises have run their course at Freckle Farm. The pig enterprise is certainly nothing like it was now. That paddock with all the cells, those 13 cells around that one house, that's the only permanent part for the pig enterprise. Everything else moved, the houses and everything. But the that's all now put back to a multi-species pasture paddock after the pigs had done the job with the brown burr. That was very successful, and now it's just a pasture paddock. And the other one is the chooks. Well, they're just doing their thing. They live in their paddock on their 8-hectare paddock and do their own thing. The cows, of course, move around the farm regularly nearly on a daily or couple of day shifts. I moved them this morning out of a paddock into a new one, so they know what they're doing. The results on the farm we bought, and we had our field day on this time last year, or tomorrow last year. We've actually sold that farm again. That's I converted that back to pasture and multi-species, and we've on-sold that farm to a friend of ours who's going to continue on with the cattle, and he's actually planted more multi-species into it on some advice. So he's going really well with his regenerative soil health that's happening there. It's going really well for him, and he's totally out of the industry. He's come from a engineering background, so it's good to see other people, and sadly we have to say this, that outside money is a good thing to come into to make change. And we saw a picture up there this morning that you don't be frightened of change. I've come into here from a broadacre background at Dysart. I've still got that farm out there, and I came in here and we changed straight away to this farming concept and direct marketing to the customer. I'm actually going back farming again. I'm going to. I'm going to go back to my farm and farm at Dysart again. I want to start farming companion cropping out there. We have a 5,500 acre dryland farm, and that's my next chapter now, is to go back and grow crops that are companion cropping and clean them on the farm and try and change the way that broadacre agriculture is heading for the future. So that's my baby now. After being here for the time, I'm going back. So, what else was there? Yeah. So we've, like I said before, we're doing a lot of multi-species planting now on the farms, and using that concept with the dryland farm at Dysart, so that's going to be another challenge going forward. But I've got a good team around me, so we'll see how we go. But that's about it in a nutshell of what's happened and where we're at, and looking forward to the next chapter of what's going on. So I'll take some questions, I suppose.
Any questions?
With all your changing in farmings by going into regenerative, I know it's same as what we did, was scary. Have you come across any negatives that you're going to go back to conventional farming, as we call it?
For me, the negative side of it's going to be the chemical. That's my biggest fear going back to the broadacre farm again. I've made a pact that I'm not going to go near the chemical because of the problems that I had in the past, and I don't believe in chemicals, but unfortunately we farm with them out there. We put a drying system in so that we can harvest green and not have to spray crops down. We're going to use a lot more cropping, so instead of spraying and holding country, we'll be continuously planting crops. And we're going to try and incorporate cattle, so it's a complete farm with no cattle, but I'm going to probably fence off a paddock and put pasture into it and Lakina, and so we've got a paddock for pasture, and then move them through the farm as well as our tool instead of getting away from spraying. Because at the end of the day, the animals are the key to a healthy farm system. So we must try and incorporate animals somehow, and if, in our case, we're able to do it on a really good scale here, but out at Dysart we'll struggle without putting the infrastructure back in. The property was a cattle property prior to us 2 people ago owning it, so they converted into the farm, so it does run cattle. So even though it's all black soil, we still have access to run cattle there. But they're the answer. The animals are the answer, whether they're cattle or what. It's got to have an animal. And something else too, you can't forget that the earthworms and all the little critters underneath are all animals as well. So not only are they on top, but they're underneath as well.
What sort of cattle have you got in place?
They're Inguni. So they're a South African Bos Taurus. So they have the same eating quality as an Angus or Hereford, but the hardiness of the Indigus, the Brahman cattle. So they're basically tolerant to anything with parasites, and but they have the temperament, or they're just a lovely animal to have around. They're very quiet. God, no. No, sorry. Yeah, no, that's our bloke beside us that we sell at the markets. That's Youngledale. No, God, no. I'm mad, but I'm not stupid. Love it. No milk. God, don't give me another enterprise.
One more question.
When you first come down and bought that cane farm there, what do you reckon was, and you saw the weeds and everything there, what do you reckon was your major limiting factor on this farm when you first...
Major what?
Limiting factor.
Limiting factor. Probably my lack of knowledge of this country. Like, I came from the Brigalow belt, where basically you put something in the ground, it grew, and it because we had very fertile country. Here, coming over the hill, and down here, I took it that, the rainfall and the soil, we could just do what we wanted, and it was going to. But the cane is such a hungry plant on the soil, and what's happened, it's just taken so long to get anything to happen. And you saw those pictures up there of the burr that came back, the brown burr. Like, it was incredible. Once stopped farming, and the cane, we ate the cane down with a few cattle we had, the next thing came was the brown burr for the compaction. And it was doing its job, but it turned clear paddocks into jungles in a matter of months, once the wet season came. But the brown burr now, looking back, it's done its job. It's still there in places, but it's nothing like that picture where we just had the slash. But yeah, my knowledge of this country was very limited, but I love the fact that coming from the dry area to the rainfall and having irrigation allowed me to, you know, if I wanted to plant something, I could get it up and grow it, whereas we had to then support the plant once it was trying to grow. So we sucked the animals in there to start the support and let everything just do what it did naturally for many years, and now we're only just starting to plough. Like that chook pan has never been ploughed yet from cane. Yeah, that's why when we were in the buggy we're going like this, because it's got 1.6 metre cane drills all through it. So there are some patches where it's just been the grazing and a bit of slashing has given us the pastures, and now we've put the multi-species in, undersowing them with multi-species grasses, 4 or 5 different types of grass seeds, and reaping the reward, and now coming back through with the little planter into the pasture that we did many years ago with our multi-species crops or seeds in with the disc opener coming back into the pastures to get the multi-species back into the pastures. So doing it in reverse instead of planting it after the pastures are in.
Any more questions? Wonderful.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Rob. Round of applause,
Thank you.
please. Thanks very much. So great to have you back. Let me see if this is going to work for me. Yay! Look at that, it worked. It's the first time today. Maybe it got a nice lunch. I would like to welcome Gwyn back to further enhance your knowledge of weeds, to teach you about weed succession and natural selection, and to just really give you some great ideas as to how those weeds in your field, in your paddock, underneath your orchards can actually give you some really valuable information on the condition of the soils.
Thank you. Where's the pinger? I've just got to find it. Just before I kick off, something to think about is that when I spoke about the landscapes, I'm now going to start looking about weed succession. And the first thing I want to talk about here is ecological, meaning logic in the ecosystem. It's great to come to a conference and have a range of information, because there is such a thing as technocentric, focusing on the what? Technology, which we've seen. I'm probably going back about the other way and starting to look at the ecocentric. So how can we start to read a plant and how can we actually relate to it? Okay, first thing I want you to think about is weeds don't just happen. Now, for me, how this presentation put together and trying to understand weeds was quite traumatic. Without getting too complicated, I took a year off work. I spent 3 years in hospital with my son who passed on. And when I was in hospital, coming out of there, I actually realised I'd become institutionalised. I'd been there for so long. And I was walking up a road, and I could see on the right-hand side where the actual, there was like bushland, and I could actually see grass sort of waving along and couldn't actually work out what the pattern was until I realised that it was shading. And as I started to look at this landscape in a completely different way, I started to realise if the grass is relating to the shading, what other patterns are there? And slowly but surely I started to ask myself a very simple question. I'll ask you the same question. When you see a weed or plant, what is it there for and what's its form and function? And what it actually is doing, it's representing what the environment is around it. So then when you look at a weed, ask yourself what's its form and function, why is it there? And when I started to do that and started to become more critical, all of a sudden this list came through. So why I'm going to talk about that in particular is that once you can understand the form and the function of the weed, you can then turn around and say, what is its environment? If you change the environment, then you can change the weed. And I'll use that term like using judo management. So that's a little bit of introduction. Okay, what triggers the weed? There's such a thing as a weed problem. Can we actually try and work with it, or can we try and change the environment? Also, do we need to have some new solutions? Now, just a quick question, how much has Roundup gone up by? Well, guys that are using it said it's going up through the roof. So as costs become higher and higher, I think we're going to have to start looking at new ways of things. Okay, do we focus on the environment or do we focus on the specific weed? One thing I want you to think about in particular is that when you actually think about the weed, I don't think it's the problem, I think it's the symptom. So one of the key messages to get across is how can I change the environment? If I change the environment, I will change the plant. One of the things which was said just before too, and this is if we said what's the big problem with what I'm talking about, is there's a difference between having a weed that cycles through seasonally and one that you hit a homeostasis process whereby it literally stays there and it won't budge. That's when you start to run into real weed problems. Okay, is climate change relating to weed problems? I think it is. And also, as we're starting to go through these major weather cycles, we're going to have more specific weeds coming at us. Can you turn weeds on or off? The government paid me to do a program down in Victoria, and I actually did some trials and worked out how you could turn the weeds off. And I used the term the judo effect. What you could then do is find out what's causing the problem and using that same issue to try and overcome the weed. And sometimes if you turn a weed on, it becomes naturalised. It just becomes part of what the natural system is. So start thinking to yourself, can I turn a weed on and off? Once you understand the form and function, I think you've got a good chance of doing it. The question is, how quickly is it going to happen? If you've never heard of Stuart Hill, very knowledgeable guy, what Stuart talks about is the fact that if you go and kill that plant and take it out, you've then got to replace its role. Now also, you can get a little bit more serious that if you are killing it, what are you going to replace it with? Remember me chopping the thistles? And then we go a little bit further, from an integrated pest management perspective, if you took out the worst pest you had, the secondary pest became the next one up. So when you start taking out plants, start thinking to yourself what's going to be the ongoing effect of it. And sometimes if you go through and you take out weed A and you end up with another weed coming through, it could be far worse. So just try and think about from an ecological perspective, where is this going to be heading if I go down that pathway? So we are dealing with plant succession. So with the successional order, it can be bidirectional. Now this is where it's going to be a pain in the butt. Okay, if this is your succession, you've got rocks down the bottom and you've got your forest at the top, just remember with plant succession it can move up and down. So if a landscape degrades, the succession starts coming down and tends to become more protective of what the plants that are there. Also, as we said before, it's accumulative. So when you get that successional order taking place, as we grow more plants, it grows what? Bigger root systems, more topsoil, and we get that accumulative effect coming through. So trying to go through and ask yourself, once we've had that major disturbance, particularly with the drought, or you may have a flood, are we able to then try and get that progression? I'm going to lead the question in saying actually weeds ultimately are part of that plant succession. It's part of a repair process. So with that successional order, we often think about soil. It's a byproduct of plant productivity. But also what we think about too is that when plant succession happens, it actually starts to modify the climates. So we think of the word rainforest. It's an ecosystem with relatively poor soil in it. And yet as that ecosystem's developed, it's been able to create its own moisture. So over time, there are such things as what they call mother plants. I don't know if you've heard of that, or mother weeds, whereby you've got one weed, and it may be a terrible weed, but actually underneath it, it's actually protecting a lot of other plants. So start thinking about with plants, they actually can start to change climates, but they also can make microclimates as well. Okay, I just want you to have a chance, just read through this one yourself, and then I'll talk about it. So it's 100 years old. It's from actually a US range management concept. And what he's saying there 100 years ago, that the actual plants themselves will create their own destruction. So in that successional order, once a plant grows to a certain height and builds up more topsoil with a bigger root system, it makes a new home for what? A taller plant with a bigger root system that keeps building. So start thinking about, if you're going to look towards plants in particular, that plant successional order, it's naturally going up. Once we take a herbicide and take that weed out, the question can be, could that successional order come backwards? Now I'll let you have a read of this one too. It's an Australian publication. So he's identifying weeds there in the successional process, but what he does say, it's not confined to one particular stage. So as a general comment, you've got productive weeds, and then you can have nitrate weeds, which are basically souped up productive weeds, or you can actually have plants which are more protective. For me, this is a personal bugbear when they talk about primary succession. They talk about moss and lichens and herbs and forbs and grasses. But when we come to a secondary succession, so agriculture is a secondary succession, it's when you've had a major disturbance, we've all of a sudden taken the words of herbs and forbs out and we substitute it straight away with the word weeds. So everybody's moved around a bit, but when I spoke before, I said, you know, what is a weed? I'm going to talk about this one in a second. It's a change of values. So what's happening here is that people have said, oh, these plants are no longer valuable to us because we're chasing potentially grass, so therefore we define them now as a weed. So the plants haven't changed, but their names have. Remember I talked about Salvation Jane and Patterson's Curse? Still the same plant, it depends on how we perceive them. So humans eat herbs and cows eat weeds. The name in the plant depends on their needs. So I tend to think about a weed as a plant, and then I tend to think about it as an indicator plant. What can that plant tell me? If you can start to read the form and function of the plant, then you can start to make better and more informed decisions. Now, is this something you learn rapidly? No. I've only been trying to learn this for 25 years. The challenge you've got is that when you have a major change in the season, you end up with a lot of cyclic weeds coming through, but just start to ask yourself, what are they doing? And don't just think about what's growing on top, specifically also focus on their root system. Now, as we go a little bit further, I think weeds are very much dealing with repair processes, and the more protective weeds, it's not so much what they're doing on top, it's what their root systems are doing. So 50% of what you're dealing with is underground. So start thinking, if you're talking about plants, don't just think about what's happening on the top, start thinking about root systems, please. Okay, a little bit problematic. It's interesting when you've got diebacking grasses, what weeds come in are mainly the taproot weeds. So they're starting to change and create a feedback loop. They're actually going through and filling out a problem. Now here, if you've got your rock and your sand here, we go through the forest where your best plants are. What I'm going to suggest is when you've had a major drought with disturbances, your succession's gone backwards. What I'm going to think, this is being not what it should be doing. Okay, this one here should be sitting up there and the weeds should be sitting here. What I'm trying to say is that When you've got a drought, the weeds will actually take it from here and repair the process back to here. That takes time, but over time, those weeds will actually start to die out. Now, from a commercial perspective, the question is, how long do those weeds take to do it? If it seasonally happens quite quickly, great, but if it takes a long time, we end up with some real major problems. Now, a lot of weeds have tap roots, particularly in dieback situation, and it's those tap roots that are actually remineralising. So think about it this way: if you've got a root that's taproot going down this deep, it's taking nutrients from here, putting it up to the leaves die off and it drops it back. That's a remineralisation process. Also, if you think about what the taproot is doing, why has the plant put so much time and effort into putting a taproot in instead of fibrous root? Because a lot of time and effort's gone into producing those root systems. So often when you're talking about weeds as a repair process, a lot of them tend to be taprooted plants. Now, in situation with dieback, often the succession has gone back even further, and these taprooted plants make a major difference. So, I don't know what people are thinking, but when I think about the term of dieback, I associate it with an ecological collapse, which is about the worst you can get. So the whole system is collapsed. You've ended up with these weeds coming in to try and repair the process. And I'm going to ask, and please, I'd like a little bit of discussion when we do have a chance when this finishes. How much feedback is there about restorative plant succession after dieback? Now, I know I'm being recorded, so I've got to be a bit careful on this one, but a client rang me up and said, look, I've got dieback, I really need you to do some homework on it. So I started to do my homework on it and went and had a look at quite a few papers, started to contact the authors of the papers, and they weren't really forthcoming with their knowledge, should I say. And I found, very, very frustrating information that they were very grey on what they were saying. How are people feeling about feedback and the research that's going on that? Is people going, wow, great results, or what's happening up here? Yeah, the word was, yeah. I was really concerned with the fact that I want to talk to people, I want straight answers, and I wasn't getting a lot of straight answers from them, so may not be politically correct, but yeah, we weren't happy with that one. Okay, so what is a weed? People will say it's an unwanted plant. Often when I did my farm apprenticeship, we were told that a weed was a plant out of place. I'm going to suggest to you really it's an opportunistic plant, and it's actually trying to improve a home. And a weed often is in the exact place it needs to be because it's actually filling in a niche in that environment. So as the environment changes, it creates a new niche, and the weed in the form of a plant fills that gap. So we do have such a thing as wands, so weeds of national significance. So a plant is a plant that has a perceived negative value to individuals, such as farmers, to councils, to states and to the nation. So with wands, they say that it has invasive tendencies and impacts. The fact is that the plants they're talking about can grow so successfully that they can outcompete other plants. Now, from a production point of view, if you had a plant that could grow that well, you'd hopefully make some money out of it. So we've got a bit of a contradiction. So sometimes you end up with a major breakthrough. And for me, many, many, many years ago, I was talking to David Holgram and at his place, and David made an offhanded remark, and it was words something to the effect of, wouldn't it be great if farmers could grow their pastures like they grew their what? Weeds. And for me, when David said that, it changed the way I was thinking, because when we talk about these plants that are so terrible, that are invasive and impacting, they are so aggressive. It's because we're actually dealing with a changing environment, and these plants have the ability to adapt to that environment. part of the big question is, and I'll deal with it a little bit further, is that when we're dealing with a climate change concept, the ecosystems that we used to have were relatively stable. If we're dealing with changing climate situations, it means that a lot of those ecosystems are actually changing, and a lot of the existing plants are dying out. If you have a look at places and documentaries like America, how they're losing tens of thousands of hectares of trees, what's going to come in is going to be called weeds, because they're actually filling that gap. So the big picture is that if we don't get an ecological understanding on weeds, we're going to have a lot more weed problems, because as the ecosystems are changing because of the climate, the weeds are going to be coming in whether you like it or not. So they tend to be highly invasive and they spread. For me, weeds can take off, and you said that, I've lost, where are you? Yep. You're saying about your burr can take off very, very quickly. The seasonal weeds I don't think are as big a threat as the ones that come in, invade, and particularly the perennial ones that just are going to stay there until their job is done. And in some situations that may be taking decades and you haven't got that much time to wait. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this one, and this is sort of the old view versus the new view. A lot of people have been told traditionally that we want to try and make sure we've got the least amount of seed reserves of weed seeds in the ground. And we want to try and kill off the weed before it goes to seed, which is logical. But let's take this a little bit further. If you think about it this way, that when you've got a lot of seed in the ground, it's not the seed that's the problem, it's going to be the environment that you're going to be dealing with. So I think the seed bank, is it a problem or a symptom? Just think about this one. If you've got 1 million seeds hypothetically, don't count them. If it's in a favourable environment, how many grow? Most people use the word lots. If you've got 1 million seeds in an unfavourable environment, how many grow? Hardly any. So it's not the seed that's the problem, it's the environment that you're going to put them in. So if you change from a favourable environment to a non-favourable environment, the weed is going to back off. But guess what's going to happen? You may find another plant which is now in a favourable position is going to take off with it. So I want you to think a little bit about turning weeds on and off. It's really about focusing on how you can change and manipulate and manage the environment of them. And once we go through and change the environment of them, we can then turn specific weeds on and off. From my perspective, think about it this way, that if you've got a chain of succession of plants coming through, once one link breaks, a new opportunity comes, and that's when the weeds will invade straight away and take that opportunity. They actually fix like a broken link into it for a period of time to put that successional order back in again. So, as we said before, plants will actually improve the environment in that successional order, and then they'll end up with their own demise. They'll actually have completed their job. So what we're trying to achieve, we're trying to get higher order plants, which are what we call production agriculture. And in doing so, we want to try and make sure we can optimise that for the longest period of time. So think about it this way. As I said before, with the plant succession, you're going from a rock through to a forest, traditional concepts. It can be bidirectional, so it can move up and down. We can have secondary succession, which we call agriculture. In agriculture, what we're trying to do is hit this word called homeostasis. In other words, this is when, I'd say this is when the land was e.g. cleared, or however it was, then we're trying to maintain, for as long as we can, a highly productive state. We're trying to keep things in balance. So that's what we're trying to move towards the future, and we're trying to have a healthy soil for as long as we can. Generally speaking, we want to try and get that self-regulation, and we also think about when we put on fertilisers to try and rebalance the soil, it's trying to maintain that healthy state all the way through. So if you've got a good season, what will happen is that you end up with a nice homeostasis place that's occurring, and that's why we're trying to maintain this balance all the way through. But we've got to rethink a few things. If you go through and you use a herbicide, what's going to happen is that the plant community itself is going to rebalance itself. You take one plant out, another plant's going to come and replace it. So, where's it going to be heading for? If you're trying to maintain that environment, you want to try and make sure that we've got the right plants in it for as long as we can to maintain this new balance that's in there. Weed invasion tells me fairly quickly that something's gone horribly wrong, and we often associate weeds with disturbance. So once we've disturbed something, it can be weather, it can be a lot of different areas, and then these weeds will come in, and then a new balance is going to be created, because the landscape is recalibrating back to where it should be. Now, if we start thinking about self-repair processes, I think weeds really are dealing with a self-repair process. And for me, when you start thinking about weeds, they do try and raise the successional order. But if we had a weed that was really, really bad, it would what? Take over the whole earth? I don't know of any weeds that have done that. Yes, they've gone through and taken vast areas. But just start to think about this whole issue of weeds is they are in a successional order, and how can I try and work them? You're not going to have a weed that's going to take over the whole earth in an extreme situation. Okay, now in this situation, I'll get this PowerPoint to work. In agriculture, as I said before, what we're trying to do is the successional order has changed, so you've cleared the land, you're trying to maintain this balance for as long as you can. So you've got a great season. The drought can come in and set your succession back. Then I'm going to suggest that the weeds actually can come in and then start self-regulating, and it'll try and move you from here back to there. It's a different way of looking at things. It also means that the weeds that are trying to do their job are trying to repair the process. In general, there's two forms of weeds. So this is a very, someone said they don't, I think Daniel said he doesn't like gross generalisations, but this is a gross generalisation. Plants are in two groups. You've got the protective weeds and they've got the productive weeds. The protective weeds have the thorns and thistles, and also I talk about here the high silica plants. And what they're trying to do is maintain the ground cover that they're trying to protect. So they're like guardian plants. With your productive plants, particularly with your nitrate weeds, you're dealing with very broadleaf plants, and generally you think about that around stock camps or where there's a build-up of fertility. Now with your protective plants, as a landscape degrades, so what's going to happen if you overgraze something, a lot of the beneficial plants are taken out because they're grazed out first. Then there's a lot of niches that's happened, and these plants that come in are the protective plants. And the protective plants are there to try and make sure that the animals don't take out that succession. So you'll see more thorns come in, you'll see coarser plants come in, and generally speaking, what happens to the stocking rates? They're going down. So part of the challenge is that when you start to see these degrading landscapes, they become less productive, so you've got less money to what? Put back in to try and fix them. What I want you to think a little bit about too is that with these protective plants, and as a general comment, I was talking to one person a few months ago, and they were saying that there seems to be an invasion of cactus into some area. The cactus coming into the area is not the problem. The problem is the area is drying out and making the opportunity for the cactus to come in. It's a very different way of thinking about things. So, has anybody got speargrass up here? Okay, so you can actually start moving and start thinking about speargrass in particular. It becomes more, a lot coarser. Giant's rat's tail, that's the big one up here. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion on this one. So when I came up here a few years ago, I did my homework because I don't like going into a place that I don't know about. and a report came out and it related the giant rat's tail to a degrading landscape. So part of the question is that is giant rat's tail is advancing into a landscape, is the actual landscape degrading, and that's why these new areas are developing for giant rat's tail to come in. It's not the fact that giant rat's tail is so aggressive per se, it could actually be the landscape's declining. So, are you dealing with an upgrading or a degrading landscape? And also, can you try and think about this thing? If I can improve the environment, then the giant rat's tail, is that going to decrease? Also, it's not a thing you want to think about too much to some degree, but with this extreme of weather that's taking place, is that actually making these sort of plants able to become far more aggressive because they can actually survive through the ups and the downs as it's going through. So is giant rat's tail the problem or the symptom? One thing I want you to think about is how can we try and manage that out? And also, is it really a case of the more productive plants have disappeared and that's why giant rat's tail has actually started to invade? Different way of looking at things. Okay, if I could ask this question, how many people have heard of, relating to weeds, the Great Southern Migration? Has anybody heard of that one? Okay, there's a few papers out there. What they're suggesting, and particularly what's happened with the drought, is that the plants from up north are actually migrating down south. As the continent is drying out, the weeds are actually coming down Australia following that drying out process. So when we think about it that way, it just confirms that it's not the weeds that's the problem, it's actually the fact that the landscape is drying out and these plants, which are very, very protective as well, are starting to follow through. I'm going to suggest that if we have a bigger problem with climate change, we're going to end up with more and more weeds coming at us. And even I think the government's saying quite clearly, are we winning the war on weeds? The general consensus is no, so we're going to have to start managing them far more. Okay, just think about it this way with the herbicide usage. How much has it gone up? It's going through the roof. We want to try and take a more ecological approach to it. And if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that we can start to learn from nature and its patterns. So, quick question. If you went onto your property, how many plants would you be able to identify? So, 10? 20? 30? Who would be able to identify over 30 plants? Excellent. How come they're all up this end of the room? So what we're looking at is if you can go through and identify your plants, can you get them into a logical successional order? And it also means that sometimes you're going to look at some plants and ask yourself where they're going to try and go through. So we'll talk about that more tomorrow and look at this successional order. And I suggest that if you can read the weed, then you can start to look at a plant really as an ecological indicator. Okay, just starting to summarise a couple of things. Now, with fertility, there's a relationship between plants and obviously weeds with fertility. So you can actually end up with lower fertility areas. So you've got these smaller volunteer plants coming in. Then you can go through and have a more medium sort of fertility. You can have high fertility, but the one I want you to focus on is excess fertility with nitrate weeds. So you can end up with so much nitrate in the soil, these weeds proliferate and take off. I will be talking about in the next section and looking at dealing with putting on sugar and also talking a little bit about soil biology as well. So this is a southern photograph. Have a little look at it and just see how many different plants you can see. Now, it's a bit trickier than what you may think. Okay. Chuck your hand up if we go more than 3. Yes? Okay, that's good. 4. 4, okay. 5. Okay, we're sitting around. 6. Okay. Now, what I'm going to get you to look at is this here is plantain or lamb's tongue. And this here is what I would use the term flatweed, right? They look the same form and function. This is classed as a herb. This is classed very much as a weed. So very simplistically, the actual flatweed's hairy and the actual plantain's not. So in this situation, when you start looking at taking the time to look at the different plants that are there, start to look at the form and function, sometimes you've just got to spend some time. And also it's great if you can get a neighbour or another friend to come along, because you can get so familiar with looking after your plants, you can't see the what? Wood for the trees. So we discussed this, I think, before I was talking to someone. You don't know what you don't know. And little knowledge is a dangerous thing. It's not the knowledge of the little. And Dr. William Walker used the term study nature, not just books. So just starting to review, weeds really are part of ecological indicators. You can actually look at weeds and relate that back to high, medium, low fertility and excess fertility. As we start to think about herbicide costs and that related issue, and is rat's tail basically a problem or is it a symptom? So I'm going to stop on that one and we'll take our break. So we'll take our break now. Yep.
Thanks, Gwyn. So Gwyn will be back in just a moment, but I thought it would be a great idea if we all had a little stand up, a bit of a stretch, grab a refill for your glass of water, and then he'll be back on in about 5.